experience includes service as an executive with Alaska Communications and previously with Doi Unlimited. He also served the University of Alaska between 1996 and 2008 in several executive roles, including Vice President of Administration and Chief of Staff. I actually would note that I met Jim during Governor Hickle's term when he worked at the Department of Administration and Labor Relations. So sort of a linkage between Commonwealth North roots and our speaker today. And as university president, as with any of the state's positions where you have any authority, you get to do a lot of other things. So he serves as a commissioner on the Denali Commission. He's a member of the Alaska Aerospace Corporation Board and on the University of Alaska Foundation Board of Trustees. His education, a Bachelor of Arts in Politics from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Now, it would be interesting to learn how that prepared him for what he's dealing with this session. A Master's in Political Science from the University of Chicago, and a doctorate in Higher Education Management from the University of Pennsylvania. He's recently joined our Commonwealth North Board as a member, and we're really pleased to have him on the board. So thank you, Jim, for your commitment to public policy, higher education, and your engagement with Commonwealth North. We greatly appreciate it. So I'm going to turn the program over to Jim to talk about the university's lands.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl, and thanks to all of you for being here today. I want to call out to 9.09% of my boss at the University of Alaska, Daryl Hargraves. There are 11 regions, so I can do the arithmetic there. I had to prove it on my little calculator here. But Daryl provides a really important 9.09% of leadership for higher education in Alaska. So thank you very much for being here, Daryl. And thanks to the folks from the university who are here. And just as Cheryl indicated, so many of you have some connectivity to the university. And that makes sense. That's our mission. Since 1915, when Territorial Delegate Wickersham supposedly tripped over a law book coming out of his office in Washington, D.C., and the law book fell open to the Morrill Act. Who knows whether that story is true, but it sure works, right? And so we were admitted as the Alaska Agricultural College and School of Mines at that time was admitted as a land grant university. My own connection to the university is actually pretty long. I showed up in Alaska on the back of the motor vessel Matanuska in the summer of 1983 with the intention of just visiting my college girlfriend over the summer, who was living in Juneau at the time and basically didn't go back. And so one of the first things I did was, are there any political scientists here in Juneau? And it turns out there was one. And so we got in touch with each other, and we've been friends ever since. But we co-wrote some papers together, and in fact, I shared it with a friend who's now a state senator back in about 1984. And I was down in Juneau not recently, and that state senator said, "Hey, Jim, remember this paper you gave me in 1984?" And it was entitled "The Politics of Paradox: Political Development in Alaska." And we'll address that concept because there are a lot of paradoxes, I think, in Alaska, right? But I fortunately was able to start teaching then. So actually, I taught political science classes down at UAS while I was living in Juneau and working for the state at the time, doing work that prepared me, I think, pretty well for the work I do now, which is basically fighting fires, right? And sitting in rooms with people who strongly disagree with each other, and trying to do something good coming out of those conversations. And again, want to especially thank Ed for being here and hopping in today. Ed just joined our team, and he's playing a really important role, and I'll talk about that role in just a minute. He's playing a really important role for us at the university to hopefully resolve this 103, going on 104-year deficit of land for the university. And there'll be quite a bit of history here, so bear with me a little bit as we go through the, let's see which is which. So plus sign, Jim, or what works this?
The bottom two buttons?
Bottom two buttons. There we go. Okay. So here's what I'm going to talk about, a little history. We've got some ideas on a solution to the problem. And then I'll describe for you a lot of our land holdings and then the money that comes from those lands, and then what we're doing going forward. Whoops, there we go. You all know this picture, right? And it really needs to be shifted a little bit to the right, because then if we did, we'd be touching the Atlantic Ocean, we'd be touching the Pacific Ocean. And university campuses would be in South Carolina, that would be our Ketchikan campus. We'd have a campus in Iowa, we'd have a campus in Oklahoma, we'd have a campus up in Wisconsin, we'd have a research vessel operating off the coast of Montana. And 1,282 miles from our campus in Ketchikan up to our campus in Kotzebue. So it's a big university system, obviously, 16 campuses. And you know, we're the land-grant university without the land. As I indicated, Hawaii got cash. Not a lot of cash, actually, but Delaware got a smaller land grant. But you know, when I'm back east and I talk with folks, I was meeting with some folks recently from Rhode Island, and they got a bigger land grant than we did. Connecticut got a bigger land grant than we did. Massachusetts got a bigger land grant than we did. And you know, those states are so small, you can't write the name of the state in the state. You have to write the name of that state out in the Atlantic Ocean. So it just is crazy that we got such a small grant of land. So going back to paradoxes. 18 states out of the 49 who actually got land grants, 100% of their state land grant went to their university. In 18 out of the 49 states, all their land went to the university. Now, I'm not arguing for 104 million acres. It'd be nice. But that's not our case. Another interesting comparison is we're often looking at other states, Washington, Oregon, California, for how we ought to behave up here in Alaska, or how we ought to operate our university system. As a share of the state's land grant that went to the universities in those states, California, 20 times ours, Oregon, 20 times ours, Washington, 100 times ours. If you look at the share that the university got of the state's land grant. So we started out with a deficit and continue to suffer from that. 110,000 acres is what we got. We've accumulated over the years another 40,000 acres, purchase, grant, donations, etc. So we've got a total of about 150 now. We were due roughly 500,000 acres at statehood. So, you know, in terms of looking at some of the financials here, I think it's important to note that we've already diversified our revenues to some extent. For each $1 of state general funds that we get, we generate 2 additional dollars. Tuition, fees, research, grants and contracts, revenue from our lands and from development. And I would note in research in particular, for each $1 the state gives us, we generate 6 additional dollars from outside of Alaska into our economy for that work. So thank you for being here, George, and contributing to that success here. And it also connects up to what you're interested in, and that is diversifying the state's economy through monetization and commercialization of the research that we do. We have a land grant endowment, of course, and we would love to, over time, build that. It's going to take time to do it, and that way we're not going to be as dependent on the state for our revenue. We will always, as the University of Alaska, be to some extent dependent on the state, but we actually have a shared interest with the administration in moderating that dependence over the long term. The federal government, of course, they made a commitment in 1915 to give us land, but some things got in the way over the years. A couple of world wars, pretty significant depression, those sorts of things interfered with the federal government's ability to actually convey us the land over those years. But finally, at statehood in 1959, the federal government said, hey, we're giving 104 million acres to the state. University, you get your land from them. So at that point, the federal government abrogated its moral act responsibilities to give us land. And I'll touch on that more in just a moment. And interestingly, as I was driving over here, literally this morning, I got a call from Governor Murkowski. And he saw that I was giving this talk. He was calling from his car down in Seattle. Actually, Nancy was driving, and it's a good thing. No, and he said, hey, I see you're giving this talk. I wanted to update you, and I wanted to make sure you knew that I strongly support your land grant. And he reminded me, and I said, no, Governor, I'm going to tell him about it. I'm going to thank you today. But he pushed through a bill from the state back in the early 2000s. And again, I'll talk about that in just a moment. But unfortunately, that went up to the Supreme Court in 2009 and did not survive a Supreme Court decision, which puts us to where we are today. So again, this history, the Morrill Act, signed by Abraham Lincoln in 1862. He signed some really, really important bills affecting Alaska 5 years after 1862. Thank you. Abraham Lincoln, Seward's Folly, the United States bought Alaska from Russia. So some important contributions to Alaska history by President Lincoln. And the whole idea behind the Morrill Act, and there are criticisms, of course, of this idea, but the whole idea was to settle the West. And the way you settle the West is you get this land out there in these universities. They have a strong interest in developing those lands. They take those revenues, they train the workforce, they create the intellectual property that will grow economies in the West. And you end up with a very virtuous cycle, building and building over the decades. So that was very much the idea. I mentioned Territorial Delegate Wickersham and the land grant statute there in 1915. 1929, we got another statute through Congress. And that 100,000 acres in 1929 really was the heart of our current land grant. So following statehood, the legislature, I don't know whether it was one of the first bills, but it certainly was in the very first state legislature. There was a land grant bill for 1 million acres to the University of Alaska, and that was vetoed by Governor Egan. I'm not exactly sure why he vetoed it. I suspect it's connected to why the Supreme Court, 50 years later, upheld the or denied basically the land grant from 2005. And that is the dedication of funds beyond one legislature binding a subsequent legislature. But nevertheless, that started the struggle. Obviously, and there are people in this room who know this history better than I do, Dave particularly, Ed, and others, I'm sure know more than I do about this, but back in the 60s and through the 70s and then in the 80s with ANCSA and all those land issues that were being addressed between the federal government and the state government, things got very, very complex. And they stay, they're very complex today as well, but we got, I think, lost in these much larger efforts here on lands in Alaska. But moving forward to Governor Murkowski and his leadership and others here in the state in 2000, a bill passed, and that bill was vetoed, and the legislature overrode that veto, and that was a 260,000 acre grant. That was challenged, went to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled that it was not an appropriation at that point, but it did include in the dicta of that decision basically an invitation to the group who filed the lawsuit to come back and assert that it was an unconstitutional dedication. And that is precisely what happened in 2007. So going back to 2005, the legislature passed another law to specify the selections. And those lands started being conveyed from the state DNR to the university. Lawsuit filed again in 2007. And then in 2009, the state Supreme Court ruled that it was an unconstitutional dedication of funds, that land, because of course we were going to use the funds for the same purposes we would use in appropriation. And so we started handing the land back to DNR at that point, and started thinking about, well, what are we going to do now? And again, I mentioned we've got roughly 150,000 acres. That's what we're sitting on today. We've got a framework for a solution. It turns out that the state of Alaska still is due 5 million acres, I believe it is, something like that. I'm looking at Ed, who really knows. The state has over-selected many more million acres, but it's still due 5 million acres of land. So we're working with the state very closely right now to see it, and the federal government. We've got some Alaskans who support resolution of these issues in key jobs back in Washington, D.C. right now. Certainly our legislative delegation back in Washington, D.C., but also in the Department of Interior. We are working it hard, and again, in partnership with the state. Let's see here. When I came into the job, there were lots of issues that we had. I knew we had budget issues, and I asked, so what about the land grant? Where are we? And the lawyers went through the law that I just went through with you. And then they showed me the Constitution, and I looked at it, and I noticed that the sentence kept going in the Constitution. It didn't stop at prohibiting the dedication of funds. It actually continues here, this fourth bullet down, but it has an exemption, except when required by the federal government for state participation in federal programs. So we started scratching our heads a little bit and thought, well, not that Alaska loves federal programs, and although, again, the paradox, we say we don't, but we do, we love them. Let's create us a federal program here and see if we can't resolve this in a way, because clearly, at least according to our reading of the state constitution and the court's decision here, we can't get a straight, direct appropriation of land from the legislature. They would support it. There's no question in my mind they would. But we've got to do it in a little bit more artfully. So we are working now on the creation of a structured federal program that would meet the Alaska Constitution's test. At the same time, it would not involve a net increase to the amount of land from the federal government to the state, nor would it involve a direct state grant to the university. Just some information here about our land holdings. We've got 151,000 acres. That's the blue over there on the right-hand side. The missing chunk, the 71%, is the gray part. And then you see how it's organized there in terms of the investment classes of our land. And roughly a little more than a third in sales and leases, and 23% in forest resources, 20% mining and materials, 11% in mitigation management, and then 9% in oil, gas, and coal. Sometimes I wish it were the inverse of that, with oil, gas, and coal in a much larger chunk. But in any case, that's what we've got today. There's an educational piece here, 12,000 acres, and that's basically where our campuses and some research facilities, farms, that sort of thing is on those 12,000 acres. A little bit more on our land holdings here. The intention of these investment lands, all but the 12,000, is revenue generation. And so we get income from sales and leases and easements and real estate space, forest timber sales. We've got a project that we're working on in Haines right now. We've done a number of very successful projects down in Southeast over the years. Glad to see you gentlemen from the gravel and rock industry there. That is a big business in Alaska. So we certainly are active in that space, and then mining coal and oil and gas. Our historical receipts are a bit north of $200 million from our land development, and that's from fiscal 1987 to fiscal 2018. And you see most of that is from real estate, sales, leases, and easements, and then down a little bit in the material mining space, timber, and oil and gas. And what do we do with the money? We put it in a fund, and then we invest that, and then we generate earnings. And those funds go primarily, the single biggest recipient of those funds is the Alaska Scholars Program. Cheryl mentioned that a moment ago. And I actually had the good fortune to be in the room. I guess it's a benefit of a small state. Back in the late 1990s when we created the Alaska Scholars Program. The intention there was to try to keep more of our best and brightest high school graduates in Alaska. So the top 10% qualify of high school graduates across the state, and each high school qualify for this scholarship. The secondary purpose of it was to tie explicitly and directly to couple resource development with the human development, the development of brains, right? And so each and every time I speak to Alaska scholars and their parents every fall when we're trying to get them excited about coming to the University of Alaska, I make sure to note that tight coupling between monetizing our land and their education and monetary support for their education. So very important connection there, and we've supported over 9,000 Alaskans with that scholarship since the scholarship program was founded, and we're now in our 20th year, which is a tremendous positive success. I would note about this, I emphasize that it's the top 10% of every high school class. It's not the 10% of just all Alaskan high school kids. It's in all 54 school districts of the state. And this brings into the University of Alaska an incredibly diverse group of students from all Alaska. So we're really consciously, deliberately trying to build a diverse leadership cohort for the state's future as well. Hard chart here to review here, but these are our receipts by resource category. And clearly the light blue is the biggest by far, and that's real estate, sales, leases, rentals, etc. I would love for this chart to be, the scale to be much, much, much higher, and for the lands that are generating these revenues to be within about, say, 10 miles of us right now, maybe 5 miles of us. That would be great for the university. University of Washington benefits tremendously from the fact that much of downtown Seattle is owned by the University of Washington, and so it's generating lots of revenue from all those big skyscrapers there. We unfortunately are not. We do have a lot of black spruce, if anybody's interested. Turns out, though, that we are talking with some folks about carbon credits. That's an interesting market now, and so that has some prospect. Some of the Alaska Native regional corporations have gone in that direction. We're also looking at conservation easements and banks and those sorts of things, so that it's not just land that we're going to dig or cut, it's land that can generate revenues in other markets. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's revenue that we're after here that would support our mission. And then our land trust balance. Of course, this is, the land revenues go into this trust. And this is the basis, the corpus of the fund that then drives the money we use for the Scholars Program, some research, and set other programs around the University of Alaska. The nice thing about those funds, too, is they're a lot more nimble. We don't need to go through the lengthy appropriation process to generate these funds and then allocate those funds. We can do so through active development. It also has a positive benefit in terms of building additional partnerships in the state, so that we're not all by ourselves, but we're actually working with industries across the state to co-develop. That was something I didn't learn about when I studied politics, but it's something I did learn about when I was working in the private sector, about how businesses work together and benefit each other as they grow together and partner. And so I think that's an important aspect of how we grow in the future. So legislative resolutions, these are alive right now. So if any of you do know anybody down in Juneau, in addition to saying, hey, support their budget, if you'd also say support those resolutions, I think they're on a fast track, and we're hopeful that we'll get those resolutions out of the legislature this year. They're not going to carry a lot of weight, but they do carry significant weight when we go back to Washington, D.C., and our delegation sees that we're all on the same page, and we're not fighting with each other over this issue. It actually turns out to be very important. We're in this process now of selecting. Dave, it was interesting to hear that you were involved in that 30 years ago, 34 years ago, I guess. And well, we're in that space right now, and that's where all the devil is, right? Is in making all these selections. And of course, you want to make selections that are going to generate revenue, but of course, you don't want to make selections that are going to generate litigation. So it's a touchy business here. You want to generate revenues short term, but also revenues over the long haul. So it's got to be a careful process, but we're in that process right now. Hopefully, we'll get agreement on this relatively soon. That the stars of the Big Dipper are kind of lined up right now to resolve our issues and the state's issues, hopefully. And once we get that agreement, then we'll move into the development mode, and then hopefully soon be generating revenue in support of our mission. And I talked with the governor a number of times about various issues, obviously including the budget, and this. The governor, again, has been very supportive of this, but I have indicated to him that you could give me a gold mine today, and it'll be 10 years before I really am able to monetize that. So don't expect to get me off the state support tomorrow as a result of successful movement on this. Still want to make successful movement on this now, so that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, Governor, we can sit here and celebrate what we did 10 or 20 years ago, and start looking at the additional scholarships, the additional research, the additional educational programs we're able to support at the University of Alaska in service to our state. I think it's really important. A lot of you in business and a lot of you who've been in the state for a long time both look long term. And the university's been here for a little over 100 years now. And like many of the businesses that you are part of, I hope your businesses will be here 100 years from now. We certainly will be, no question about it. We've gone through a bit of a planning exercise recently, and it's not a traditional strategic planning exercise where you do, the SWOT thing we all do, and what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, and our opportunities and threats. And then you identify your goals and your objectives and your measures, and then you resource all that. We actually went through a process recently where we envisioned the University of Alaska in 2040. So we decoupled, in a way, the current constraints and asked ourselves questions like, what if, fill in the blank, what if we had a medical school in Alaska? What if we figured out where the king salmon were going? What if we figured out how to get heavy oil out of Prudhoe Bay? What if we figured out fetal alcohol syndrome? Now, those are hard problems when we sit here today, even with the smartest people in Alaska, to figure those problems out. But it's relatively easy if you relax a little bit and look out 20 years. Yeah, we probably will have solved those issues by 2040. So with that provocation, we created a vision for the university's future in support of Alaska's future. We created about 25 really cool programs. We invented a narrative, a timeline that goes out to 2040. We will have won a Nobel Prize by then. The UAA Seawolf women's hockey team is playing the Nanook women's hockey team for the NCAA Division I championships by then. So you can have some fun with it too. And we created 6 narratives, fictional people, but fairly realistic. Faculty members, students, business folks, and how they interacted with the University of Alaska in order to achieve their goals at that time. So I encourage you, when you get a chance, to just go to alaska.edu and go down the page a little bit, and you can see an interactive website, and you can play around with those programs, and you can follow those people through their careers, their lives from 7th grade to post-secondary education and beyond. And again, you can play with that timeline a little bit. And I think it's the kind of thing that we need a whole lot more of here in Alaska, a positive vision for the state's future. We're, I think, right now really struggling, and we're fighting with each other, unfortunately, a little bit too much, and that's disabling us from doing the kinds of things that Alaska has done for decades and decades, actually for thousands of years, where people have come together and they've laid out a vision for a strong and confident future, and they work together to create that. So I'm hopeful that we can, at the university, not only serve today's needs in terms of workforce and research, solving real problems that Alaska faces, but we can also lead in envisioning and then realizing a vibrant, sustainable future for our state. And that's why we all are here, whether we were born here and decided to stay, or whether we came from someplace else. We're here because this is a tremendous place where people like us can make a huge difference. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
There's some who were just simply asking about how are lands selected? How do you decide which lands, who gets to decide that? And I have a question question about sitting over at your table over there is Jeff Jesse, who in a past life, as he mentioned, was involved with the Mental Health Trust. So how does the Mental Health Trust have its land, but now you can't?
I don't know. I mean, Jeff would know, you would know. Please.
I'm a land specialist at the Trust Land Office for the Trust Authority as our sister organization, but the Alaska Mental Health Trust had a entitlement back in 1856. There was 1 million acres that were a congressional act to designate 1 million acres for supporting mental health services in Alaska. That's the shortest story I can really make it. There's still some, with the university, something a little bit similar. There's still some remaining entitlement too, where the lands have been selected, they haven't been surveyed yet, or conveyed to the state, and then onto the trust. So I just jumped in because that's my world at the moment.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So then the bottom line with predated statehood, is that the?
It was one of the lead-ups to the Alaska Community
Okay.
Plan.
Okay, interesting. Okay, well, there was a question about how are lands selected, and there's this perception that there aren't a lot of really good lands, valuable lands, potential income-producing lands available. So, you know, what's the big deal? And let's say you got all the land you want to select, and will it really make much difference in your challenges, your fiscal challenges?
Obviously, the selection process, as I indicated, you know, we're going after what lands the state has selected that have not yet been conveyed to the state. So that's our focus, and I defer to experts like Ed and others at our university, and even in DNR, because they have a shared interest in our success here to actually go in and figure out what the maximum value lands are. They're going to be all over the state. It's a very complex exercise, and Dave, you know it well, right? Having tried yourself, and then we had a whole team doing it back in the 2000 era, 2005 time, when we went through that selection process. But it's certainly financial criteria, legal, political criteria, social, cultural criteria. You have Alaska Native interests involved there. You know, so there are lots of factors that go in. So there's some smarter people than I am on specifically how they get selected, but I think those are our goals.
Yeah, I'll just make one quick comment. The biggest criteria, and I think over the decades we've had in getting appropriate land to the state or to the mental health or to the university, has been competition. In other words, like when we were doing university lands, we were told you can't touch anything in the municipality of Anchorage. That's off limits. That's granted. You go out to certain areas of rural Alaska and they say, no, the villages have first choice. And so, okay, there are two huge things before you can get into your criteria what kind of land you want. One is that Alaska doesn't have a huge amount of real good developable land. Most of our land is wetlands, mountaintops. It's good for resources. It's great land, and it's big enough that we still have plenty of land for our needs. But is it available to get to select? Once you find that it's available, then you go into competition and make negotiated deals. We'll take this, and we'll let you have that, a lot of that. And then after you've done that, of course, you hopefully have criteria trying to, as you mentioned, trying to guide us.
Yeah. Thank you. Ed?
Yeah, I would just add that kind of one of the first steps is to look at what is the pool of available land that the university can actually look at. And as a lot of you know, there are many different flavors of land in Alaska. Some of those flavors are more accessible to the university than others. Others are just not available at all. And so, as President Johnsen mentioned, the state is still owed 5 million acres of land. We've over-selected that by double, so we have 10 million acres of selections on top of federal lands. In addition to that, there are another 10 million acres of top filings, which are selections that are encumbered by various, I believe, outdated federal land orders. So there's a 20 million acre pool out there of lands that that are potentially accessible. The other thing is that I think a lot of our lands are potentially developable. There's just access issues, and we don't know much about the resource base too. We're still learning about the resource base, and there's a lot of new information out there that the state and the federal governments have accumulated over the last several years. So.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and this ties into one of the other questions was about the perception that the university, that folks, Alaskans, think that the university simply refuses to develop its land to get the most return on the investments. And so suggests that the university improve the public's perception of a land grant institution. And I think this gathering, frankly, is helping a lot towards that goal. So it was a good observation. So somebody else has a follow-up to what was recently responded by the president, but they understand correctly that it's the state's constitution that has caused some of these land problems. And if so, have the framers been asked if they could have foreseen the issue compared to other states' constitutions? So the irony here, of course, is that we can actually talk to one of our framers, the only one that's still alive, Vic Fisher, who, hell, I can't remember what he did 2 weeks ago, and I don't even know how he does it. So that was just a little saving. Okay, so is it really the Constitution that caused the problem? Is that what the court said, the Supreme Court?
Yes. Yep.
So is anybody talking to it?
Well,
Would it matter?
I mean, there are studies, there are biographies, there are histories of the university which we definitely read, and so I think we understand Vic's view at the time. And again, the legislature, the very first legislature, passed a 1 million acre land grant to the university. So I think clearly the intent of a lot of the state's leaders at the time was strongly in support of this.
Yeah. Okay. All righty. Well, one other question from our delegate from Kentucky. That he talks about in Kentucky that they have a land grant university system too, and all the revenue from the land grant is used to offset tuition. And then, in fact, one university has no tuition but re-gives in that 20 hours per week of all the students do volunteer work at churches and nonprofits. And so really the scholarship program is a way of re-giving, certainly. So has there been any other, I mean, you've got other problems to deal with besides returning money. I'm just saying. Any observation?
Well, I was just going to share with you Kentucky. Let's see, 93% of the state of Kentucky's land grant went to the university. 93%. Alaska was 0.1%. So,
Wow.
pretty big.
And a follow-up, Berea College that I mentioned
Yes.
there. Berea College, which I had my younger son attended. If you get in, Berea University, but they were chartered in, they were chartered in 1852, believe it or not. And nobody pays tuition. If you get in, but you have to work assigned by the university 20 hours a week to a church, a nonprofit, or to a school. Well, then they were trying to teach people to read, in all honesty. And in 1861, the entire student body volunteered for the Union Army.
Wow.
If that gives you any idea. So the point is, land grant schools have been around, but our own Constitution's killing us. And maybe we should have a fourth constitutional amendment, just as a suggestion.
Yes, of course.
Well, thank you for that. I think we found an approach here, and again, not only did I get a call from Governor Murkowski, but within a few minutes as I was driving over, so I thanked him and said I was going to mention this, and then I got a call from Jim Clark, who was Chief of Staff to Governor Murkowski, who said, hey, I want to help you with this, I've got an idea for you, and I'll send you some legislation. So we've got some, Jim, I'm sure, Alan, from your time with Jim. So there's some strong interest here. I was hoping that Senator McKinnon would be here today, and I could make a little point that something I really learned from a conversation I had with her, and it was literally an elevator conversation. down in Juneau, and she was co-chair of Senate Finance. And I got on the elevator at about floor 1, and she got on the elevator at floor 2, and I was heading up to the 5th floor, that's where finance is, to meet with her. And I greeted her, and she said, "Hey, President Johnson, I'm sorry I can't meet with you. I've got another meeting and just got to attend on the 4th floor. So tell me your pitch. What did you want? What did you want to say?" And of course, I had this, pitch and building up and subtlety and nuance and all of that. And so it was this time where I had to have an elevator speech. So I'm, 2, 3, get to 4. What do you say? And I said, the University of Alaska is strong. We face challenges, just as our state does, but we will succeed. And she said, "All right, got it, thank you." Door opens, she walks out. And I kind of thought, wow, that worked. So I just want to share that with you as I close today. We are strong. We are a strong state. We're a strong university. And yeah, we face challenges, but damn it, we will succeed. So thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. So this was great because it's certainly a subject matter that we don't get to talk about a lot and we don't learn about a lot. So let Commonwealth North know how we can also help as the issues move forward. And one of the things that Commonwealth North does that is different than most other organizations you might belong to or haven't yet joined is through our study groups. And as Mary Ann, and I pulled her down, she co-chairs she chairs the energy policy study group, and they meet about every other Friday or so, and they have speakers come in, get updated about energy-related issues, and it's a great way, if that's an area of interest, for you to be engaged and have the opportunity to ask questions, participate in the discussion. Eric and I co-chair the fiscal policy study group, and we have a third co-chair because the issue is so important that Senator McKinnon is also now our third co-chair, and we're really thrilled to have her, obviously, for her knowledge and insight into the issues. So we tend to meet on Friday mornings, most Fridays, and again, bring in key policymakers, past policymakers, others who have opinions on fiscal policy issues. So we're about to embark on a new project there. But again, it's a great way, it's a different way in which to get engaged, get educated, gain knowledge, and ask questions that you've always wanted to. And then we also we're starting up a new one called food security. And I don't know if, for those of us who used to be in Juneau, back in the 90s, and so you could tell when the barge didn't get in because the shelves at the grocery store were very empty and the milk wasn't there. And so we've had some of those experiences here in Alaska. And remember when the earthquake hit, there was talk about, well, what if? Something had happened to the port. So this is, I don't have no idea if that's what this group is talking about, but I think it is. And it's a brand new study group. So if you're interested in that topic, contact Jim or Aaron, and they'll get you clued into the email list and the notices about that meeting. So it's a different way in which to be engaged, and we appreciate all of you who already come to our meetings and participate and contribute to our discussions. So finally, in the back of the room, there's these maps. They're a commemorative map signed by the former living, couldn't sign it if you were dead. That was bad. So they're signed. So if you'd like to buy one, what are they, $15?
$20.
20? Okay, I was going to give a deal. So $20, and it's a great keepsake. So if you have a wall that needs a picture, this would be a very nice addition. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Again, if you're not a member, please join. We are a membership organization, and your participation is what makes Commonwealth North